Hey dude, what key is this song in?
What key is this song? What key is this song?
What key is this song?
It seems like a simple question, right? But if you're like me, there was a point in your life where that question could have induced a small panic attack, or at least an awkward moment of silence. What key is this song in? I used to find myself in that situation more often than I'd like, but I finally figured out that every song contains all of the information that you need to know in order to reverse engineer the key of that song. Maybe you're at the point where you can make educated guesses about the key of a song based upon context clues and the frequency of certain chords, but wouldn't you rather have a definitive system to know for sure what key you're in every time you're asked that question? Well, if so, stick around for today's lesson, because today I'm going to be showing you a system that will eventually help you figure out every song lickety-split, just like that, so you can impress all of your friends and save yourself that panic attack at the next jam session. Okay, let's start with something simple here. If you're like me and you come from the realm of American roots music, whatever that means these days, right? Bluegrass, country, folk, rockabilly, rock and roll, any of that kind of stuff. If you play a related genre to that, you've probably seen this chord progression or a variation of it at some point in your life. G, C, D, G. If that's the case, you probably already know what key we're in, but hey, entertain me for a sec. Why exactly is that chord progression in the key of G major? One of my early guitar teachers gave me a really simple checklist that doesn't require any music theory, or at least a limited understanding of music theory, to see what key of the song you're in, and I think this chord progression is a great one to use that on. I like to call it first chord, last chord, frequent chord, feeling. So all I mean by that is, what's the first chord in the song? What's the last chord in the song? What is the most frequent chord in the song? And what chord gives you a feeling of resolution and a landing spot? So if we use this set of rules on our favorite G, C, D, G chord progression, it's pretty easy to figure out what the key of the song is. G is the first chord. G is the last chord. G is the most frequent chord. And G makes you feel like you've achieved a resting point or resolution or landing spot, whatever you want to call it. That's all good and well, but what actually makes this chord progression in the key of G? Or maybe another way to frame that, what notes inside of that chord progression are responsible for G being the tonic center or root of that key? And what if you were dealing with a chord progression that doesn't fit into one of those neat little rules? What if one chord starts the tune, but it finishes on another? Let's look at a new chord progression that muddies the water here a little bit. G, D, E minor, C. So what about this progression? Are we still in the key of G? Let me show you a system to confirm with 100% accuracy what key we're actually in here. First, we need to take each chord and name all of the individual notes in the chord. This is where we kind of roll up our sleeves and have to get to work. So if you're not that great with note naming, check out my lesson on naming the notes on the guitar to get more comfortable with that before we move forward. Okay, so let's take that first chord and go through these one by one. So we've got our G chord here, right? If we start on the lowest string, our E string, we've got a G note. E, F, F sharp, G. Then we've got a B note, a D note, a G note, a D note, and a G note. Now for the purposes of this exercise, we can reduce all of the chord tones down to just individual unique tones. So that means we can throw out any double notes that we have. That means for G, we're just left with G, B, D, what I like to call the bass triad of that chord. Now let's do that for the rest of our chords. For our D chord, we've got D, A, D, F sharp, so D, F sharp, A. For our E minor chord, we've got E, B, E, G, B, E, or E, G, B. And then for our C chord, we've got C, E, G, C, E, so C, E, G. Now, if we get all of those chords lined up in our triad format here, the thing that we want to do next is take all of those notes and, starting on one pitch, put them in alphabetical order. So if we go back to that original list of rules that my guitar teacher gave me, let's start with maybe the last chord in this chord progression to see if that's the key center for this progression. So that means we're going to be starting with a C chord. So start with a C note and then line all of your pitches up in alphabetical order as they go in the triads. Now once again, if we're left with any double notes, you can throw those out. We just want to have one set of unique pitches. So that means in this chord progression, we're going to be left with C, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B. And just for giggles, I like to put another C at the end. I like to double my notes. We're going to use this later. Now, after you do this, how many unique pitches are you left with here? Okay, so if you're left with 7 unique pitches, that's awesome because now we have all of the information we need to know in order to determine the key. Why, might you ask? Because each major scale has 7 unique pitches. So if we have 7 pitches, that means we've got a major scale. We just have to figure out which note in that set is the root note of that major scale, then we have our key. But how do we know what note is the root note of that major scale? Well, if you're familiar with the pattern to generate a major scale, if not, check out my lesson on how to generate a major scale, then you'll know that the pattern to generate a major scale is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So what that means is we need to go back to our set of pitches, C, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C, and then measure the intervals between each pitch. So starting with that C note, C to D, if you're familiar with the chromatic scale, C, C sharp, D, so that's a whole step to get from C to D, D to E, D, D sharp, E, that's another whole step, E to F sharp, E, F, F sharp, another whole step, F sharp to G, half step, G to A, whole step, A to B, whole step, B to C, half step. So that means that we're left with the following set of whole steps and half steps. Whole, 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 half, whole, whole, half. Now wait a second, what's the major scale pattern again? Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. You see what I'm getting at here? That pitch that we selected for our first pitch didn't end up being the key of this song. We are not left with a C major scale here, but what scale are we left with? Well, if we rearrange the pitches to fit into that whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half pattern, you'll see that G actually ends up becoming the pitch that is the root of this major scale and thereby the root of the key of the song that we're in. Awesome! We have found the key of that chord progression. But now it's time to confirm the data. Let's go back to that original set of rules from my guitar teacher and see if we can glean anything from those. So, what's the first chord in this progression? G. Awesome. We're in the key of G. We know that. So, that seems to fit. What's the last chord in the song? C. So that's what kind of screwed us up to begin with, right? But let's move on to the next rules and see if those help us out. What's the most frequent chord? Well, that doesn't really help us out here either because each chord has the same rhythmic value and appears just as many times. It's a loop, right? So rule number 3 doesn't really help us. Okay, and let's get to the last rule. This is the one that I'm really driving at here. What feeling do you get from listening to each one of these chords? So if we were to stick with that original C chord, let me play through that progression one more time. Okay. See, to me, when you hang on that C chord, it feels unresolved. It feels like you're still hanging in midair and you want to hear another one of those G chords. So, that last rule actually helps us confirm that G major is the key of the song. The last chord in this chord progression is designed to push our ears back to that G major at the top of the next form. Okay, my friend, this methodology covers all of those chord progressions and others that I didn't cover at the beginning of this video, but get ready for a major plot twist. Plot twist number 1. What if you only have 2 chords in a song? This is something that's extremely common in American old time and bluegrass music, and honestly, a lot of modern pop tunes. So what if you only have 2 chords in a song? To tackle these 2 chord songs, I like to use my scientific method plus the set of rules that my guitar teacher gave me in order to figure out the key of the song. For example, let's look at the chord progression D and A. So the first thing that I like to look at is there a special relationship between those 2 chords? In this case, yes. D and A are separated by a perfect fifth. Now, this is a very special relationship in chord progressions because a 5-1 resolution really helps us determine what key we're in only from 2 chords. If one chord is a fifth away from the other one, then that means that chord is the 5 chord in that key, and it typically likes to steer our ears back to the 1 chord. In this case, A is the 5th, and then D is the root. Doesn't that sound so good when you go back from the A to the D? So that's one way to determine what key we're in with a two-chord progression. Is there a 5-1 relationship? But what if your chords don't fall into that relationship? Say we have an A minor and a G chord. Now that chord progression fits squarely into the key of G major and C major, right? In C major, it's the 6th chord, G is the 5 chord, in G major, A minor is the 2 chord, and G is the 1 chord. So how do we know which key we're in? This is where we once again have to go back to that set of rules that my guitar teacher gave me. So what's the first chord? A minor. What's the last chord? A minor. What's the most frequent chord? They're about equal, but I would give emphasis to A minor. And what feeling do you have? To me, that feels like the landing spot. So in that instance, once again, A minor wins out, and those rules have helped us. But what if we flip those chords around? In this instance, in my opinion, the chord that you start and end on really affects which one is viewed as the tonic. So G, when you start on it and end on it, and G becomes the most frequent chord, then all of a sudden, G feels like a really natural key center for us. So this scientific method is great, but those rules that I used at the beginning of the video still really help out when we only have 2 chords. Okay, plot twist number 2. What if you line up all the pitches from the triads that you generate in a tune and you're left with more than 7 unique pitches? If that's the case, we're probably dealing with what I like to call borrowed chords or secondary dominance, meaning that we're actually mixing and matching 2 different keys in one song. This can be kind of confusing, but let me talk through this a little bit. In bluegrass and gospel music, there's a really common type of chord progression that uses a secondary dominant, so let's check that one out. So in that chord progression, we've got a G, a C, a G, an A7, and a D7. If we line up all of our triad pitches, we're left with GBD, CEG, A, C sharp, E, G, and then D, F sharp, A, C. So wow, we've got a lot of C's and C sharps in there. If we put that all in linear order, starting on that G note, we've got C next to C sharp. So that doesn't really give us a clear idea of what major scale we're in, right? One thing that we need to look at in these types of chord progressions is the first rule that I looked at with 2 chords. Is there a special 5-1 relationship that exists in that progression? In this instance, that A7 chord to the D7 chord is a 5-1 relationship. And that A7 chord is also the one responsible for that C sharp note, that extra note that we get in that G major scale. So that means we're actually borrowing a chord from the key of D major, the A7 chord, to steer our ears toward that D7 chord as a temporary resolution. I know that that can seem pretty confusing, but if you were to line those pitches up on your own and you didn't know that rule, you might be pretty confused, like, well, dang, I thought I had this down, right? But in this instance, all we're doing here is just borrowing one chord from another key. So if you're left with more than 7 pitches, 8, 9 pitches, you're probably dealing with some secondary dominance. Now, if you're confused by the terminology I'm using here, dominant chord is typically a term that we reserve for the 5 chord in any key. The dominant chord likes to steer our ears back to the 1 chord or the root chord in any given key. So in the key of G, D7 really likes to steer our ears back to G. And in this instance, that secondary dominant chord, that A7, really likes to steer us to a D. But in this instance, we're kind of like borrowing that chord to emphasize that D7. So check this out. Still a really nice resolution. So So it makes a really nice chain of dominant chords. And this is really where we can kind of use some of our creative liberties. And if you're into classical music or jazz music, this is a really, really common type of resolution, and you're going to need to get familiar with it in order to work your way through reverse engineering some of the keys in those genres. Okay, my friend, there you have it. All the knowledge you need to determine the key of most simple chord progressions out there. If you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by everything that I said here, no worries. Just rewatch this lesson a couple times, and if you're feeling extra overwhelmed by the note naming aspect or the major scale aspect of this, stick around for the end of this video because I'm going to be queuing up those 2 videos I mentioned before that explain how to name notes on the guitar and how to make major scales. Lastly, if you enjoyed this lesson, be sure to hit that like button below and the subscribe button so you get notified whenever I upload a new lesson here to the channel. If you're interested in things like PDFs of some of these concepts to help you work through them a little easier, check out the link below in the description to the Guitar Club. That's my premium membership service where you'll get access to not only those PDFs, but extended cuts of lessons and monthly live Q&A calls with yours truly so you can ask me any of your daunting theory-related questions. All right, my friend, that is it for this lesson. Thank you so much. I hope you get a lot of value out of this one. I know that I did when I started to learn these concepts. So be sure to practice, try them out at your next jam session, and don't be too scared when someone asks you, what key are we in? All right, my friend, take it easy. We'll catch you later.